4 million years ago, the sun hung heavy over the savanna, bleaching the grass into brittle, golden straw.
The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the cracked earth until the air shimmered in waves. At the edge of a shrinking watering hole, a single Australopithecus stood motionless. Dust coated the skin, masking the scent of sweat. Every muscle was locked in a state of absolute tension. The ears twitched, rotating toward a low, rhythmic vibration carried through the ground. A predator was moving somewhere in the tall grass, unseen but closing the distance. The Australopithecus shifted weight, toes digging into the dry mud, eyes darting across the horizon to catch the slightest flicker of movement. There was no shelter here, no high ground, only the vast, open expanse and the encroaching shadow of a threat that had not yet revealed itself. The creature drew a sharp breath, nostrils flaring as it tasted the wind for the scent of musk. The silence of the plains was not peace, it was a trap. Every second that passed without a strike was a reprieve. Predator vanished, scent gone. Stillness held till pulse calmed, then dropped to all fours and moved toward the riverbed. The ground here was littered with debris, a chaotic mix of silt and debris. Fingers raked through the sediment, pushing aside smooth pebbles and dry stalks. Then, the hand stopped. It closed around a jagged piece of quartz, the edge sharp enough to catch the light. The creature lifted the stone, turning it over to inspect the serrated fracture. It pressed a thumb against the edge, feeling the bite of the rock against skin. A drop of blood welled up, dark and small. The ancestor did not pull away. Instead, it struck the stone against a larger, stubborn root protruding from the mud. The root splintered. The impact sent a jolt of vibration through the arm, a sensation entirely new and electric. This was no longer just survival by instinct. The creature looked at the stone, then back at the root, and struck again with deliberate force. The environment had been an obstacle for eons, but in this moment, the relationship shifted. The ancestor stood, gripping the jagged edge, and looked toward the horizon with a new, focused intent. The landscape transformed. The golden savanna vanished, replaced by the biting, damp chill of the Pleistocene forest. Shadows stretched long and deep as the temperature plummeted, turning breath into visible plumes of white vapor. A group of Homo habilis moved through the dense undergrowth, their movements synchronized by the urgency of the encroaching night. They reached a sheltered hollow beneath a limestone overhang and stopped. One of them knelt, hands cupping a bundle of dry tinder. The wind whistled through the trees, threatening to extinguish the effort before it began. A strike of flint against stone sent a shower of sparks into the nest. They caught, flickered, and died. The group leaned in, blocking the draft with their bodies, creating a wall of living warmth. Another strike, a thin thread of smoke rose, followed by a sudden hungry orange tongue of flame. It licked at the dry wood, growing until it cast a steady pulsating light. Faces that were previously lost in the gloom were suddenly sharp, illuminated by the shifting golden glow. They sat close. The night had a center. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows against the cave wall as the group turned their attention to the day's harvest. A stiff, blood-matted hide lay stretched across a flat stone. One of the group reached for a sharp-edged flake, its surface chipped to a razor-thin point. They pressed the edge against the thick, dried membrane, pulling with a steady, rhythmic motion. The hide resisted, stubborn and tough, but the stone bit deep, shearing away layers of fat and connective tissue. Each pass of the tool left a clean, pale strip of skin exposed beneath the grime. They worked in silence, their movements precise and practiced, stripping the material down until it became pliable. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and raw protein. As the hide thinned, they rubbed it between their palms, kneading the fibers until the stiffness gave way to a soft, supple texture. This was no longer just about the immediate consumption of meat. It was the deliberate creation of a barrier against the elements. The fire dipped low, the flames retreating into a bed of glowing, pulse-like embers. Outside the circle of light, the forest had become a wall of absolute black. A sudden sharp snap of a dry branch echoed through the clearing, followed by a low, guttural vibration that traveled through the soles of their feet. The group froze. Every head turned toward the darkness. Somewhere in the dense thicket, a pair of eyes caught the faint orange light, reflecting it back. The air grew heavy, charged with the scent of damp musk and wet fur. A second, deeper growl rumbled, closer this time, vibrating against the rock wall. The group scrambled, grabbing heavy branches from the woodpile and thrusting them into the embers to reignite the blaze. The wood caught, sending a sudden burst of sparks upward, but the beast did not retreat. It paced, a rhythmic, heavy thudding of paws on frozen earth that circled their position. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, brandishing the burning sticks. The temperature continued to drop, turning their exhaled breath into thick, swirling clouds that obscured their vision. Every shadow seemed to stretch and lunge. They held their ground, staring into the void, knowing that if the light failed, the forest would claim them. They were merely waiting for the sun to break the siege. The morning light revealed the vast expanse of the plains, and with it, the necessity of change. Scavenging was no longer enough to sustain the group. They moved out from the shelter, their eyes scanning the horizon for movement. A herd grazed in the distance, their heads dipping and rising in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The group fanned out, moving with a new, deliberate silence. They no longer wandered, they tracked. They utilized the tall grass as cover, crouching low and synchronizing their steps to the swaying of the stalks. A lead hunter raised a hand, and the line halted. They had identified the weakest member of the herd. The strategy was simple but required absolute unity. They began to close the distance, moving in a wide arc to cut off the escape route. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the hunters stood, their bodies coiled with tension. They raised their spears, the sharpened tips catching the morning sun. A signal was given, and they surged forward. The hunt was no longer a desperate gamble, but a demonstration of collective force. The era of the hunter gave way to the era of the traveler. Homo erectus emerged from the shadows of the forest, their bodies refined by the demands of a changing world. They stood fully upright, a posture that freed their hands and altered their perspective on the horizon. The ground beneath their feet was no longer an obstacle, but a path. They moved with a steady, rhythmic gait, heel to toe, covering miles that would have exhausted their ancestors. Each step was a deliberate displacement of weight, a mechanical efficiency that turned the vast, sun-scorched plains into a traversable landscape. They did not run, they persisted. They walked through the heat of the midday sun, their frames casting long, unwavering shadows against the dust. A micro-turn occurred when one individual stopped, adjusted the grip on a stone tool, and scanned the distant mountain range before resuming the march. This was not aimless wandering. It was a systematic expansion. They moved in a line, their bipedal stride carving the first permanent trails across the continent. They were becoming a species defined by movement, pushing toward a future that spanned beyond the reach of the horizon. The horizon was no longer the only boundary they watched. As the sun dipped below the plains, the sky transformed into a map of cold, distant light. Homo erectus gathered around the embers of a dying fire, their eyes turned upward. They had learned that the world was not static. They tracked the slow, rhythmic rotation of the stars, noting how the constellations shifted their positions as the nights grew longer. This was a new kind of hunting, a hunt for patterns in the chaos of the night. One individual pointed a finger toward a specific cluster of lights, tracing its path across the dark expanse. They understood that when these stars reached their zenith, the dry season would break. They began to correlate the movement of the heavens with the migration of herds and the ripening of wild grains. This cognitive leap changed everything. They marked the passage of time by stacking stones in alignment with the rising moon. Each stone was a record, a physical manifestation of memory. Survival was no longer just about strength. It was about the ability to see what had not yet happened. The sky lost its warmth. The stars that once served as a reliable map now shimmered through a thin, biting haze. A subtle change in the air pressure signaled the end of the long cycle of stability. The wind shifted, carrying a sharp, metallic scent. Vegetation that had thrived for generations began to curl and blacken, turning brittle under a new, relentless frost. The group encountered the first sign of the crisis at the riverbank. The water did not flow, but stood trapped beneath a layer of jagged ice. They reached out, their fingers recoiling from the stinging cold. Every breath now hung in the air, a visible plume of vapor. Animals that had once been plentiful retreated into the deep brush, their tracks disappearing under a dusting of premature snow. The group huddled together for shared heat. They moved with urgency, searching for shelter that could withstand the encroaching bite. The horizon now looked like a closing door. The era of the open plain was ending, and the era of the deep freeze had begun. The limestone cave offered a reprieve from the howling wind outside. Deep within the rock, the air remained still and constant, shielded from the encroaching frost. The group moved into the shadows, their presence marked only by the rhythmic scraping of stone against bone. They worked in silence, a collective focus. One individual held a splinter of animal bone, grinding it against a rough slab of granite. The motion was repetitive, precise, and deliberate. With each pass, the bone thinned, sharpening into a needle of unexpected delicacy. Nearby, another worked with crushed minerals, mixing red ochre with animal fat. The paste was smooth, vibrant, and ready for use. They were not merely surviving the cold, they were mastering the materials at hand. The needles they produced were thin enough to pierce hide without tearing, a leap in technical capability. They tested the points against their own calloused palms. Every movement was measured, a silent language of skill passed between them. They laid the finished tools on a flat ledge, a small collection of progress. The cave walls began to show faint traces of pigment. They sat in the dark, surrounded by the evidence of their own ingenuity, waiting for the next shift. The silence in the cave shattered. A crunch of frozen gravel echoed from the entrance, sharp and distinct against the muffled wind. The group stopped their work instantly. The rhythmic scraping of bones ceased, replaced by the sound of shallow, synchronized breathing. One by one, they rose, moving toward the dim light of the cave mouth. They pressed their backs against the cold limestone, peering out into the twilight. A group stood at the edge of the clearing, their forms silhouetted against the white expanse of the tundra. They were different. Their movements were fluid, their posture upright and alert. The Neanderthals did not retreat. They stood their ground, hands tightening around the tools. The distance between the two groups narrowed to a dozen paces. Every muscle in the cave entrance tensed, prepared for a sudden strike or a desperate flight. The newcomers halted, their eyes scanning the cave opening with calculated precision. No one spoke. No one signaled. The air between the two groups grew heavy, thick with the weight of an unprecedented meeting. Two distinct lineages now occupied the same space. The standoff held until a single figure from the newcomers stepped forward. He did not carry a weapon. His hands remained open, palms turned slightly upward, a gesture that cut through the defensive posture of the cave dwellers. He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a smooth obsidian blade, holding it out at arm's length. The leader of the Neanderthals watched the object, then looked at the man. Slowly, the Neanderthal lowered his guard. He reached for the bone needle he had finished earlier, the one with the finest point. He stepped into the light. The exchange was brief. The obsidian blade passed into one hand, the bone needle into the other. No words were uttered. The Homo sapiens nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. He turned and signaled his group to retreat. They turned back into the cave, the new tool held carefully in their grip, their understanding of the world fundamentally altered. The climate began to shift. The relentless cold that had defined the era started to retreat, leaving behind a landscape in flux. Rivers swelled with meltwater, and the vast frozen plains gave way to patches of green. For the nomadic groups, the old patterns of survival were breaking. They moved across the terrain, but the herds they followed were becoming erratic, disappearing into the thickening brush. The constant walking, once a necessity for life, now yielded fewer rewards. One evening, a group halted near a river bend. They did not move on the following morning. Instead, they watched the water flow and the way the sun hit the fertile soil. They had spent millions of years as shadows on the horizon, never staying long enough for the earth to remember their footprints. Now, that changed. They set their bundles down. They did not hunt that day. They observed. They saw the way seeds gathered in the silt, the way the river provided a constant, predictable bounty. The horizon was no longer a destination. It was simply a boundary. They stood on the bank, looking at the land with new intent, preparing to break the cycle. The decision to stay manifested in the physical labor of the following days. They stopped looking for caves and started looking for stone. They gathered heavy, flat slabs from the riverbed, dragging them to the clearing near the water. The first attempt at a wall collapsed under its own weight, the stone sliding into a heap of dust. They did not abandon the effort. They adjusted, digging a shallow trench into the earth to anchor the base. One by one, the stones were fitted together, the gaps filled with mud and packed clay. It was slow, grueling work that left their hands raw and their muscles strained. By the second week, the walls stood waist high. They used timber from the nearby grove to bridge the top, creating a frame that held against the wind. For the first time in history, a structure stood that did not belong to nature, but to them. It was a crude, heavy thing, but it was solid. The group stood back to survey the enclosure, the first permanent mark on the landscape. They had traded the freedom of the horizon for the security of the hearth. The shelter provided safety, but the hunger remained. They turned their attention to the wild grasses swaying in the fields beyond the settlement. They noticed that certain stalks held heavier grains, and that these grains fell into the soil only to sprout again when the rains returned. They began to gather these seeds, not to eat immediately, but to store. They cleared a patch of earth, pulling out the stubborn weeds, turning the soil over with sharpened sticks. The ground was hard, resisting their efforts, but they persisted until the earth was loose and dark. They knelt in the dirt, their fingers digging tiny furrows into the ground. One by one, they dropped the seeds into the rows, covering them with a thin layer of soil. It was a calculated gamble against the seasons. They watered the patches, carrying heavy vessels from the river. The work was repetitive and exhausting, requiring constant vigilance against birds and insects. Days turned into weeks of careful tending. They watched the sprouts emerge, a vibrant green line cutting through the brown earth. This was no longer scavenging. It was a partnership with the cycle of life. The surplus of grain allowed time for other pursuits. They looked at the heavy loads they carried and saw the limitation of their own strength. They cut a thick section from a tree trunk, shaping it into a perfect circle. It wobbled at first, catching on roots and rocks, but they smoothed the edges and fitted it to an axle. The friction vanished. A load that required 4 people to drag could now be pushed by 1. The invention of the wheel changed the scale of their world. They did not stop there. They turned to the stones that burned with a different fire. They built deeper pits, lining them with clay to trap the heat. They fed the flames with charcoal, blowing air through reeds to push the temperature higher. The rocks melted, turning into a glowing liquid ore. They poured the molten metal into molds, waiting for it to harden into shapes that would never break or dull. They hammered the cooling metal, shaping blades, plows, and axes. The rhythmic strike of hammer against anvil replaced the silence of the wilderness. The earth was being reshaped by the heat of the forge and the rotation of the wheel, marking the end of the slow, ancient cycles of survival. The tools were sharp, but the true innovation was invisible. It began with a sound, a specific pitch meant to warn of a predator or signal the location of water. They stood around the fire, their throats working, shaping air into distinct patterns. One hunter pointed to the horizon, then tapped his chest, then mimicked the movement of a herd. His companion watched, eyes narrowing, then repeated the sound. The connection was instantaneous. They were no longer limited to the present moment. They could describe the past, warning of a storm that happened 3 winters ago, or plan for a hunt that would not occur until the next moon. The sounds grew into complex sequences. They assigned names to the stars, to the rivers, and to each other. They sat in the dark, voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that mirrored the complexity of their thoughts. Information moved from one mind to another without physical contact. This was the birth of history. Every story told became a map for the next generation, binding them together in a web of words that spanned across the plains. The noise of the forge and the rhythm of the spoken word fade, replaced by the heavy, damp silence of the earth. The camera drifts deep into the limestone interior, where the air is cool and still. It moves past jagged stalactites and smooth, water-worn walls, searching the shadows. A beam of light cuts through the gloom, tracking across the uneven rock face. It stops. There, pressed into the mineral surface, is the outline of a hand. The pigment is iron-rich, a deep ochre that has stained the stone for millennia. Every line of the palm, every joint of the fingers is visible, pressed firmly against the rock. It is a mark of presence, a physical assertion of existence left in the dark. The camera holds on the print, highlighting the texture of the stone beneath the pigment. There is no movement here, only the stillness of a gesture frozen in time. It is not a tool, not a weapon, and not a word. It is simply the record of a human touch, a deliberate act of leaving a trace behind. Millions of years of movement, migration, and survival have led to this single, quiet point of contact. The handprint remains, a permanent signature on the wall of the world, marking the end of the long, slow climb from the savanna to the cave and beyond. The light source begins to flicker, its intensity waning as the beam narrows. The vivid ochre of the handprint loses its sharp definition, softening into the surrounding shadows of the limestone. The texture of the rock face recedes, swallowed by the encroaching dark. One by one, the details of the cave wall vanish, leaving only the memory of the mark. The silence is absolute. The light shrinks to a single pinpoint glow before it finally extinguishes, plunging the screen into total blackness. In the void, the weight of 4 million years remains. The journey from the sun-scorched savanna to this final, quiet imprint is complete. What remains is the stillness of a species that learned to walk, to hunt, to speak, and to leave its mark upon the earth. The screen stays dark, holding the space where the story ends and the reality of the present begins.